Welcome to the Institute for Human Sciences. A warm welcome on this September afternoon. We are live and live streaming along with those of you who are here in person in the audience, and thank you for coming and joining us. My name is Vejvoda. I'm a permanent fellow and I lead the Europe's Futures program here. And for those of you who have listened into the two previous events this month, we have a fifth generation of Europe's Futures Fellows. We have heard from four of them already, and this time we will hear from the next two fellows, Kristof Bender and Heather Grabbe, whom I'll introduce in a little while. Today we will be discussing the topic under the title Ukraine, the Western Balkans, and how to revive the broken EU accession process. The enlargement of the European Union is one of the focal themes of the Europe's Futures Fellowship over these past 5 years. We've had in every generation a number of fellows who have worked on this. That is the case again this year, and of course it has been in a sense supercharged, if I can use that term, with the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the candidacy that has been rightly given, in my view, to Ukraine and Moldova, and potentially to Georgia if it meets the necessary requirements. Of course, we could use the famous film quip and say, Houston, we have a problem. Problem because the EU enlargement has been stalled, to use a rather neutral word, in the fact that since the enlargement to Croatia on the 1st of July 2013, we have not had any further enlargement, although we have a number of candidates who are in the pipeline in the Western Balkans, and now obviously with Ukraine, certainly the biggest country of more than 40 million people. Let me remind you that the Western Balkan countries, the six countries that are vying for membership, all in all, well, until a few years ago had 18 million people, but with the latest censuses in these countries, for example, Macedonia has gone 10 years ago from 2.1 million down to 1.8 million. In Serbia, there's an expectation that there will be 700,000 people less than 10 years ago, from 7.1 or 2 down to 6.5. So we're talking about a region of 6 countries, yes, but half the size, less than half the size of Ukraine's population, just to give some factual moments that I think are not irrelevant to our discussion. We expect the meeting, or the first meeting of the European Political Community in Prague, and an idea that was launched by French President Emmanuel Macron, and basically to take the 30,000-foot view. Europe whole, free and at peace, to use American parlance, is far from finished, because the European integration process, or the return to Europe as it was called after the fall of the Berlin Wall, has not been accomplished. So to discuss all these themes with us this afternoon, we have first of all Kristof Bender, who is to my immediate right. Kristof is the number 2 person of the famous European Stability Initiative, a think tank, very propulsive, energetic think tank that has come up with many important ideas over the years since its inception, which is 20 or 25 years ago.
End of 1999, last century.
Okay, nearly half a century. If I may say, I and many of us have known them since the very beginning, when they were budding young Europeans who realized that the accomplishment of the integration of Europe was an important thing. Many of them started their careers in Bosnia and Herzegovina around the High Representative's office. Many came from different areas. They are truly regional. They have people from all over the region and have done many things like creating a series of films on the region, presenting many policy papers. And the number one person, Gerald Knaus, as you know, is somebody who's extremely active. Hard to pin him down on where he is on any given day, given that he is visiting chancelleries, ministries, and TV studios. So Kristof will launch us with a presentation, then to comment, and much more than comment, because Heather is also a Europe's Futures Fellow, somebody who is deeply involved in enlargement for many, many, many years. First of all, because she did her academic work and doctorate on that, but then equally, if not more importantly, was in the engine room of enlargement of the European Commission when the Commissioner for Enlargement was Olli Rehn, the Finnish politician who did many things after that. But Heather was his right hand and was privy to many important moments in the whole policy definition of the enlargement. So Heather has deep internal insights apart from being a passionate person about Europe. She, after that, joined the Open Society European Policy Institute and has led that institute for many, many, many years, and is now an advisor and consultant to the Open Society Foundation writ large. Much more, of course, on the details of everything, but what I want to say is that we have two people who have worked on these issues for many years, and I think we will have a very lively discussion on the way forward. My final sentence will be that this fellowship, that is a strategic partnership between the Erste Stiftung and the Institute for Human Sciences, is deeply committed to seeing a democratic Europe thrive, as it is faced with many global challenges, geopolitical challenges, always, but in particular now with the Russian invasion. So this is as much an academic and research exercise as it is a policy and activist exercise. Kristof.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And, thanks very much, Ivan, for these very, very kind and generous introductory words. It's a real privilege to be part of this Europe's Futures program, and it's great to be here at the IWM here. And it's also great to discuss, about this not really very new, but still I think very relevant and ever more pressing topic. So let me just head straight into it. The EU accession process is broken. Take North Macedonia. In 2009, the European Commission recommended the start of accession negotiations because the country has met all the required criteria. Today, 13 years later, the country has still not opened a single negotiation chapter because of a series of bilateral vetoes which had nothing to do with European standards or with accession criteria. Take Bosnia. It was we counted that from the time when they, trying to hand in an application, that the application was forwarded to the Council, that the European Commission said there are other conditions that you need to meet in order to be recommended the start of negotiations. We counted in total 31 conditions, most of them arbitrary and unrelated to the process, in the sense that no other country had been asked to do these things. Or take Serbia, one of the front runners, where according to the European Commission's own assessments, except for a little step in one of the chapters over the last 2 years, from 2019 to 2021, there has been no progress in any of the chapters. This process does not deliver, and I think anyone who is following the Balkans a tiny bit is well aware of this. But the big questions which we have been debating for years actually here also is how to get this process going again, how to turn it again into a genuinely transformative process, like in the last enlargement rounds when it made a huge contribution to the dramatic changes in the economies, in the administrations, in the societies of Eastern Europe, from Estonia to Romania. In a way, it wouldn't be so difficult if there was a political will, but there is not, or is not enough. But that's, how to say, that's the point where we need to start from when we want to explore realistic options. So what I want to do now is basically I want to start from 3 realities which I think constrain and frame what can be done at this moment, and then quickly sketch 2 ideas. First reality, if we like it or not, some EU member states are deeply skeptical or outwards hostile to further enlargement. And this is not going to change anytime soon. Let me just quote you Emmanuel Macron on the 23rd of June this year, directly after the kind of historic European Council granting candidate status to Ukraine and Moldova. He said, "Today, we cannot tell Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, or North Macedonia that it's over. They committed themselves. They made lots of efforts. So in this context, we need to advance. This is a question of credibility, but also a geopolitical issue." But then, a little bit later, he says, then at a certain point in time, there is a contradiction between this geopolitical approach and our ambition to deepen the ties inside the EU. There is a process of enlargement. They entered this process. Good for them. But let's be clear, it will take a lot of time. Some may not be able to finalize this process. Essentially, it's not new. It's what he has been saying since 2017-18, institutional reforms first, enlargement later, if ever. Off the record, I think he is even more clear on this. And in a way, it's also similar to what Olaf Scholz has been saying at the end of August in Prague. He said, "I'm committed to the enlargement of the European Union. But a European Union with 30 or 36 states will look different from our current union. We must also make the EU itself fit for this great enlargement. This will take time." So, internal reforms before enlargement. Second reality, the EU accession process is not meritocratic anymore. It is not motivating reforms. There is this claim, still today, the EU accession process continues to be based on established criteria, fair and rigorous conditionality, and the principle of own merits. That's the European Commission in last year, 2021. So there's this idea, the further a country gets, the more reforms it undertakes. It moves from potential candidate status to becomes a formal candidate. It opens negotiations, then it opens individual chapters. It opens more chapters. There are 35 in total. It starts to close chapters, closes all chapters, becomes a member. The European Commission assesses kind of progress systematically every year in all these relevant areas. There are 5 grades, from early stage to well advanced. Now, when one looks at these assessments today, it's actually quite weird. There is no link between the actual preparedness, as assessed by the European Commission, and the formal status in the accession process. Overall, when you look at sort of all the chapters, the preparedness in all of the chapters, as assessed by the European Union, North Macedonia, a country which has not even started accession negotiations yet, is as prepared as Serbia, who was negotiating for 8 years, and nearly as prepared as Montenegro, who was negotiating for 10 years. When one looks at these fundamental first issues, that was an idea from about 10 years ago, which in fact I think makes a lot of sense. The idea is to focus on key areas from the very beginning in the accession process, and at the heart of this lie the rule of law chapters 23 on judiciary and fundamental rights, and chapter 24 on justice, freedom and security. Now, Montenegro and Serbia have been asked at the very beginning of their accession negotiations to draw up detailed, very thick, action plans for both of these chapters, and they were asked to report every 6 months, in detail on the progress made, on the implementation of these measures of the action plans. But now, when we look at the assessments of these priority reform areas under the rule of law fundamentals, North Macedonia and Albania are, which have not, of course, opened any of these chapters because they haven't opened negotiations yet. So they also have not, at any stage, drawn up any of these action plans. But they are as prepared as Montenegro in these areas. They are better prepared than Serbia, and they're, of course, far ahead of Turkey. But then the question is, I mean, what's the point of negotiations if a country who hasn't even started the process yet, is as prepared as countries who have started for 8 or for 10 years? The current accession process looks like a bus without wheels. And the fight that North Macedonia is now carrying out, desperately wants to basically start this process. It's a bit like kind of they fight for moving ahead, 1 or 2 rows towards the front of this bus, of a bus which is not even moving. Third reality, even as already mentioned it, I think the membership applications of Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia have created a new dynamic. That's slightly more optimistic point here. Yeah. The heinous attack of Russia has created pressure to act, also on the more reluctant EU member states. So what a few months ago seemed unconceivable to most of us, I think, happened in June. That Ukraine and Moldova would be granted candidate status barely 3 months after handing in an application. This is good. This is an opportunity to revive the process. It's also something I think our friends from the Western Balkans should really take note of. It's an opportunity for all. And I think there is just more attention and there's more pressure to act with Ukraine than with the Western Balkans. I think that has become also pretty clear when one was listening yesterday to the speech of Commission President von der Leyen. However, I think if nothing else changes, if this process remains the same as it is now and is managed in the same way, there is a huge risk that Ukraine and Moldova, soon will find themselves in the same position as the Western Balkans, stuck in a process that is not meritocratic, without a clear and credible and attractive goal. So I think that the challenge is that currently there is no link between merit and formal progress, and the promise of membership at this moment is not credible. There's a widespread perception in the Balkans, whatever we do, it doesn't really matter, we won't be allowed to join. This is not inspiring, it's not motivating, it's the opposite, it's really demotivating. And it weakens reformers in the region, in these countries. It strengthens the Europhobes in those countries who then can turn around and say, listen, see, I told you all along that they are not serious. I think as long as member states insist that there have to be internal reforms before future enlargement, this problem will stay. It will stay for years, possibly for many, many years. A move towards more qualified majority voting as suggested by the Germans, by the French, well, this is fine, but there are others who clearly oppose this, so to find a solution to this will be a long and difficult process. But this is where we are, that's the starting point. We cannot ignore this, so if we want to move, that's from where we have to move, which makes moving actually quite difficult. So at the end, what can be done, under these constraints to breach this negative, frustrating dynamic? 2 suggestions. One, for the EU to announce that the EU is getting ready to accept Montenegro as a full member by early 2026, provided it manages to reach a good level of preparation in all areas, in all chapters. Is this ambitious? Yes, it's ambitious. Is it possible? Is it feasible? Why not? It took Slovakia 34 months from the opening to the closing of accession negotiations. So Montenegro has opened already all chapters. Why, if they really work hard, why shouldn't it be possible for them to close all chapters in 24 months. Add another 50 months for ratification, and there we are in early 2026. I think it would be a very strong, a very urgently needed signal that it is still possible to join, that this process, that it's worth to be part of this process. I also think it would be justified. It's not a present. In the end, Montenegro still would need to meet all these criteria in order to be allowed in. So by just basically, announcing this opportunity, actually nothing is given away. Montenegro is also very small, 620,000 inhabitants. So it would be very cheap, essentially. And finally, the European Union already had 28 members. The seat is still warm, if you wish. So no institutional changes are needed. I think that this would be really tremendously helpful. It would change the dynamic, but I think it also wouldn't be enough. The EU would also need to, to fill this process with meaning, with a reachable, attractive goal for all the others. And it would need to do this now. I think we cannot wait until the European Union has and its member states have agreed on a complicated, slow process to internal reform and a reform of their decision-making procedures. So how could that be done? So second proposal, the EU to declare that every European democracy that meets the criteria, including respect for human rights and the rule of law, as assessed by the European Commission in its annual reports, would gain access to the European single market and the four freedoms, free movements of goods, services, people and capital, and to the European Union funds. Now, this would lead respective countries very, very close to full membership, but without a seat at the table. It would essentially address the concern of the French and of other skeptical EU members. The single market covers the vast majority of the EU acquis. It covers most EU policies. And so for those countries who would manage to meet these criteria and who would manage to join the single market, it would mean that their citizens, their enterprises would actually benefit more or less from the same rights, from the same benefits as those of EU member states. It wouldn't be an alternative to membership. Full membership would still be the goal. But all countries who want to join the EU also need to join the single market. It's pretty clear, no? So it would be just a huge step on the way to this goal, an attractive goal in itself, which could be made reachable also in this current situation where we are in. It's essentially what Austria, Finland, and Sweden went through when in the early 90s it was also possible difficult for political reasons to basically offer them full membership. So they joined the single market first, which made them very well prepared and allowed them to join as full members relatively soon and quickly afterwards. We would need no institutional changes, we would just basically need an announcement, or if you want a nice treaty with those who are interested, basically making this offer, and maybe some increased capacity in the European Commission for an increased or strengthened level of assessments. And it would have two I think tremendous advantages, and I will stop there then. The first one is it would get bilateral vetoes out of the way for most of the process. It would be up to the Commission to actually make assessments and to, do this work. There is no interference of member states in this. And only once a country has reached a good level of preparation in all areas, then at the very end we would need a political decision of the member states to admit them to the single market. And the second huge advantage, I think, would be that we could offer this to all European democracies, regardless of their formal status in the accession process. So including Kosovo, including Bosnia. It would allow basically to open this up and bring in all the Western Balkan countries into this process. And of course it could also be offered to Ukraine, to Moldova and Georgia, and thereby actually fill also for them this process with meaning and give them an attractive goal on their way to future membership. Yesterday in her State of the Union speech, von der Leyen announced her work with Ukraine to ensure a seamless access to the single market of the EU. That's good, it's great, it's encouraging, but I think there's still a long way to make this actually really happen. But I think it should happen. I think otherwise there is a big risk that Ukraine and Moldova too, would soon find themselves in the same bus as the Western Balkans, in a bus without wheels. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kristof. Since you importantly mentioned von der Leyen's State of the Union speech, we know that she is in Kiev today, and that is, I would say, one of the proofs, or at least she's trying to prove, that it is truly a geopolitical commission, as was announced when they were nominated. And also an attempt to show that they will not be stuck and they want to move forward. Now, that's, of course, a desire and a wish and a hope, and I hope that they will be able to move forward more quickly. And just to remind ourselves that one of the realities that you mentioned about the skepticism of a certain number of member states, but also that a lot of times domestic politics in member states infringes on the process of enlargement. I mean, we need to remind ourselves that the mentioned country, North Macedonia, was first of all blocked by Greece for 27 years. And then it was actually blocked by France in 2019 after the historic Prespa agreement, where finally the leaders of the two countries exhibited courageous statesmanship against the majority public opinion feelings in their two countries to actually reconcile and sign an agreement where North Macedonia was, quote unquote, allowed by Greece to move forward. So France blocked it, and then because France blocked it, then Bulgaria was given a space where they could use their domestic political reasons, as you rightly said, Kristof, which has absolutely nothing to do with the actual requirements of the EU enlargement process, but brings in a lot of, let me just say, historical issues that have nothing to do with democracy and the rule of law. And over all these years, for those of us who have been involved, there have been, proposals on how do we tackle this. The most, of course, how should I say, ambitious one was make them all members immediately, or level below that, make them all candidates immediately, to the more realistic ones that we're looking at now, and the one that you just mentioned, single market, or the one from the think tank CEPS about stage enlargement. Let's bring them closer and closer to the table, which would assuage many of the skepticism of member states. And again, for those of us who are in this business, the whole debate about deepening versus widening has been there for, Heather will know exactly, for more than 30 years, but she can illuminate us on that. So this is, in my personal view, a completely vacuous debate, because deepening and widening has happened always at the same time. And thus to invoke on the part of Macron, this is a way actually to stop enlargement. Yeah, we'll have much more to say, but I could not resist saying what I just said. Heather, I know you have so much to say, so please indulge us.
Well, together, Ivan and Kristof, you have analysed the current situation very accurately, and I find very little to disagree with. So what I'm going to do instead is to give you some prequel and some sequel. So prequel in terms of why is it so difficult? Why is enlargement, which seems like a no-brainer to, for example, many Americans and those who work on geopolitics, like this is by far the EU's most successful foreign policy. It is perhaps the only one that's really transformed other countries. The EU hasn't managed to do that with money or with other forms of conditionality. So why not use this tool more? And then I'll move to the sequel, which is what could be done now. And I'm just going to add to Kristof's two very good proposals with another one as well. So first of all, why is enlargement so difficult? And really, it's all about who is in charge of the process and whether there is a geopolitical or security imperative. So basically, if we think about what happened immediately after 1989, there was tremendous. There were some initial offers of thinking about Europe whole and free, thinking about having reuniting of Europe. There was a lot of talk about this, particularly after the unification of Germany. But it was actually very difficult to get market access for the products of Central and Eastern Europe, because of course domestic producers were against what they thought at the time were sensitive sectors. I mean, it was steel, which is still an issue with Ukraine, but also textiles and shoes and all kinds of things like this. And in fact, it was Jacques Delors who went to the European, there was no, the European Council in those days wasn't quite the same as now, but he basically went to the heads of state and government after the kidnapping of Gorbachev, and said, and then the shelling of the White House in Moscow, and said, listen, this is a security imperative. We have to take these countries in. Look what's happening. The Soviet Union is falling apart. We must offer them more. And that's when there was the birth of PHAR, which was the Poland and Hungary Aid for Restructuring the Economy. Remember that? And also that's when the very first commitments started to be made. So essentially there was a geopolitical and a sense of strategic competition, in fact, with the Soviet Union, which helped to overcome these domestic interests. And that has been the story of enlargement all the way along. The critical moments when big decisions were taken to allow countries in were when geopolitical or security imperatives overcame the myriad issues of resistance. And I put it to you that the story of the Western Balkans is a sad story of, in a way, of the region stopping to be a security problem for the European Union. That's why it got stuck, because you then didn't have the impetus to overcome that resistance. So if you think about the key moments at which geopolitics prevailed, it only happens quite rarely at some very particular historical moments. It happened in 1991 when Delors managed to overcome. It happened again, I just give you roughly the most important ones. 1999, Helsinki, when the decision was taken for the Baltic countries and Slovakia, which had just got rid of Mečar, to be given, to start negotiations. So that was a key moment. And there too, that was also a moment of concern about Russian influence, particularly in the Baltic states, and the NATO decision was key. Then we had 2003, which was about the Balkans with the Thessaloniki Declaration. That was definitely security and imperative. That was a sense of, okay, we've got the Ohrid Agreement. There was nearly, another war in Macedonia. The Ohrid Agreement had been signed. Solana pushed very hard for this. Again, it was about security considerations. That's why the Thessaloniki Commitment was made, which we're still referring to, by the way, nearly 20 years later, because there's been nothing better than that. Nothing has superseded Thessaloniki 2003. Then there was 2005, when the decision was taken to allow Bulgaria and Romania to join together, and in 2007, not 2008. And that, again, was about concern about Russian influence, particularly in Bulgaria, and organized crime and so on, plus also the decision to start negotiations with Turkey, another geopolitical imperative, very tricky. And it was a miracle that happened, actually. I was in the Berlaymont at the time, in the commission, and it could have easily been scuppered. France immediately had buyer's regret and started putting new conditions in, having said yes. And Merkel was also quickly rowing back too, but that decision was made. And Austria too. And then now, right now, so that was a series of things. So 91, 99, 2003, 2005, and then we didn't have a geopolitical moment. We didn't have a security imperative until 2022. That's why everything has been stuck for so long, because resistance to new entrants is always going to be there, from domestic economic interests, because of bilateral disputes, because of those who prefer to deepen and change the EU. It's risky for the EU. It's risky for any member of a club when new members come in and when they change things. And they did change things. Now, the resistance to new entrants, I think, has actually grown since the Thessaloniki in 2003, for reasons that are nothing to do with the Balkans or indeed Ukraine, Moldova. One is that the process has just become so incredibly bureaucratic. It's too complex, there are too many conditions, and there are too many veto points. Overall, there's more than 100 veto points for every single one of the 27 member states. So, and that was not the case before the 2004 enlargement. Then it was, as what Kristof was arguing for, the countries went through the negotiations and then the member states had their say and the European Parliament went to national parliaments. Now it's the opening and closing of each chapter. Now I do bear a little bit of personal responsibility for this because I did some of the tweaking of I was involved in some of the tweaking of the conditionality. And the whole idea was actually to provide more incentives along the way, that the opening and the closing of each chapter should be a big hurrah moment with benefits offered, but instead it became a gate that was, instead of being surrounded by champagne and fireworks, it became a gate that could be held closed by any one of the 27 member states. So I think Kristof's point about offering something that doesn't involve all these veto points is really important. Largely because the conditions in the acquis, this might sound paradoxical, but the conditions for membership and the acquis communautaire to adopt are actually not quite precise enough on the key issues. If you look at rule of law, you know, chapters 23, 24, which Kristof mentioned, really important, rule of law, corruption, organized crime, there isn't really any acquis communautaire. And that means it's easy for any member state, for example, those working in The Hague or those working in Paris, to say, no, these conditions have not been met, because it's really hard to measure how they're actually met. But of course, that's also because of another reason why resistance has grown: rogue member states. The complexity in the European Union and the reason why there's now so much more call for qualified majority voting, as Scholz argued for example, in his Prague speech, the QMV has gone up, is because some of the members that joined in 2004 are blocking everything, particularly in foreign policy. In fact, I mean, I think Viktor Orban has become one of the major reasons for resistance to new members coming in. What happens if we get more Hungaries? Hungary's population is also dropping. You know, it's well below what it was even when Hungary joined. But that blockage on so many issues, from sanctions on Russia through to gas, through to all of the fights about rule of law and so on, has also made it more difficult, because it's just already the EU is very difficult. And then there's Brexit. Having the UK out, the UK was always a big fan of enlargement. Now, if you're French, you would say that's because the Brits don't want deepening. I don't think that's actually true. It's more that the Brits were less worried about deepening, for sure, but also the Brits tended to bring many of these geopolitical and security issues to the table and argue for those being, they should overcome the resistances. And that means that countries like the Netherlands and France, and indeed Austria, which are more cautious about enlargement, have become relatively more important because the UK is away from the table. So these are all the reasons why this has happened. Now, that's why I think Ukraine in particular is a game changer. And I'm really glad that Moldova is now on the kind of coattails of Ukraine. It's an incredibly important country. Our seminar today is not about Moldova, but I just like to register. I think we should have a seminar on Moldova because it's a very important situation there. But Ukraine is a game changer because now the security and the geopolitical stakes have gone up again. They're high for enlargement for the first time since 2003, and this can overcome the malaise. So I think this is really beneficial for the Balkan countries. But it's complicated how to make it work. And just to give you an indication of, I said it's a very bureaucratic process. It's basically, it passed in about 2004, from 2004 after the big enlargement. Responsibility for enlargement had been largely in the hands of foreign ministries and foreign ministers, and defense ministers were also concerned about it, and it passed to the sectoral ministries. And they're the ones where the resistance lies. So the fact that Ukraine is very squarely in the hands of the foreign ministers is really significant, because the historical significance of the moment and the pushing on that, the momentum, can actually help to overcome the resistance. So what can happen with this? Well, One thing is the fact that there is actually a kind of desperate search for alternatives to accession through the European political community. I think we might actually take that as an encouraging sign. That means that the prospects for accession have suddenly gone up quite dramatically. Why else would you reintroduce the idea of a European political community, which is such a hackneyed old thing that François Mitterrand first introduced in 1989, and it's being brought. Macron even said as much to his ambassadors at the end of last month. He said, yes, I know, here we go again. You've heard this before. And the reason why he's pushing it again is because suddenly there's a real prospect of accession. So, and he said very clearly to the ambassadors, by the way, that this is a means of, he said two things actually. He said it's to stopper, which is an interesting bit of franglais. He said stopper la logique de l'élargissement infini, to stop the logic of an infinite enlargement of the EU. But he also said it's very important to have this to stop Russian and Turkish influence in the Balkans. So having the French president talk about strategic competition, again, this is a good thing. Finally, they've noticed. I wish he'd also looked at maybe Chinese influence, but you know, this is in some ways this is good news. Suddenly it's passed to the Élysée. It's gone out of the agriculture ministry in France. That's good news for the Balkans. So how could we reimagine the accession process now with this new impetus? And I just add to Kristof's two very good proposals that it needs to be done very differently by offering, I think, more than simply the acquis of the single market. Because the single market, yes, it's actually dividing up the single market into the things that benefit the Ukrainian and Moldovan economies immediately. So, for example, the roaming charges that von der Leyen announced yesterday, that's been in the works for quite a while, actually. But that kind of thing where the population benefits is enormously important, because then you empower the reformers. Very important point you made. Empowering the reformers is the magic. That's the fairy dust of the accession process. The conditionality doesn't really work as a sort of canal lock system. It doesn't really work. What it does is it can help to catalyze a domestic dynamic of reforms. But it only does that if, first of all, the conditions are credible, but also if the rewards are tangible for the population. The conditionality has only really worked in the Balkans because it took so long to get anywhere with it, when there's been a direct and immediate benefit to the people, not to the government. Visa liberalization. Okay, so when were the real changes made in Bosnia and Herzegovina on cross-border policing and on rule of law? When visa liberalization was at stake. Same with Ukraine, actually. I think Balázs can tell us more about this, but rule of law progress and independence of the judiciary, this took off when Ukrainians had the possibility of visa, well, it's a long process, but visa liberalization. And that's key. So I would say, yes, single market, but not just the kind of eat your porridge kind of parts of the single market, also the benefits. As the Germans say, you can't have alla Peitsche und kein Zuckerbrot. You know, you've got to have the benefits along the way as well. So I would say, and we can go into this in more detail if you really want to start breaking apart the acquis communautaire. I love doing this, but don't feel obliged. But there are things like roaming, but there's also of course energy, electricity markets, things that Ukraine really needs right now. And I would say the key way to do that for Ukraine and Moldova to bring a new impetus and get it out of the malaise is also to do it through the Green Deal. So I would add that also to your proposals. I have written a bit about this, and I'm working on this further. But given that the EU is going to have to be the largest organizer, if not the largest provider, of all of the reconstruction aid to Ukraine, it makes sense for Ukraine's economy to be reconstructed according to not just single market standards, but European Green Deal standards, and to leapfrog the current stage of industrial and economic development of the EU to the future green economy that the EU is aspiring to. And, for example, to build the renewables, to provide the hydrogen, to provide the green steel, to be fully integrated into European supply chains. So I would go further than the single market. It's not just about the standards. It's actually making Ukraine part of the new green market that the EU is trying to build, because that would guide assistance in investment. It would give more incentives for the flow of private capital into Ukraine. It would, frankly, lessen the resistance from sectoral interests in the EU, because it's clearly intended as part of a move to a more sustainable economy. It's Ukraine not competing with the existing interests, but actually clearly heading into the future. And it accelerates the energy transition in all of Europe, because it gets Ukraine out of Russian gas as well as Europe out of Russian gas. So I think that would be my kind of sequel, my addition to it. And of course that also works for the Balkans. Wouldn't it be great if we were talking about hydrogen production in the Balkans rather than lignite? And the energy needs of the Balkans are also incredibly dominated still by Russia and Chinese ownership of infrastructure too. So it would break some of those strangleholds. And the key is to present it all in these geostrategic terms, because that's the only way to get it out of the bus, which is currently driven by the sectoral interests, and onto the high-speed rail. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you very much, Heather, for those insights on the prequel and sequel. It's really important to remind ourselves constantly of how this whole thing evolved in time. Just a follow-up question to both of you before I open it up to the floor, and that is that we've had a number of regional initiatives that have attempted to complement the stalled process. The most notable one was, of course, launched by Chancellor Angela Merkel, the Berlin process in 2014. Realizing that things were not advancing, she took the initiative to, as it was colloquially put, to invent a coal and steel community for the Balkans by working jointly on infrastructure and energy. And what she did and the German government did was to ask the regional leaders to come to Berlin with joint projects cross-border. I mean, one of the most notable ones was the Serbian president and Kosovar prime minister came with this idea of building a highway between the southern Serbian city of Niš and Pristina. I know that the Bosnian delegation came with 5. Countries worked very hard to come and do their homework that was asked by Muti to move things. Now, the problem was that nothing of this came to pass. So much so that, given the new awakening of the European Union to Russian, Chinese, and other influence, made that Ursula von der Leyen came last summer to Belgrade and Pristina and said, we're actually going to give money for this project. So 7 years later, and so they gave money for the first 30 kilometers of that highway. So positive awakening. We haven't done enough, and how I like to put it, understanding finally that geoeconomics is geopolitics, and that we have to go back to some of those things. Now we know that there's an attempt to renew Berlin process too. Scholz came out very strongly. He has a team working there. They're looking for ideas. They've been asking around, people, what do you think would that be? Secondly, we have a regional cooperation council, the sequel to the Stability Pact for Southeastern Europe, that our friend and politician who passed away recently, Erhard Busek, ran for a long time. They have the project of the common regional market that has advanced, as Merkel said, for the whole enlargement process at a snail's pace. Exactly to your point and to what we all know, people did not feel that things were happening. Then there's CEFTA, the strangely named Central European Free Trade Area, where there is no Central European country anymore, but it's kept the title. They also are working, following EU rules, on creating a free market. That is all terrific, The problem that many have, and politicians in particular, are saying, well, look, nothing has really happened. Now, I put the blame and responsibility on our countries who need to do the homework and who need to be pushing the desire to have rule of law and markets that are underpinned by independent courts and prosecution and the other. So my simple question to you is, how do you see these already existing things that have attempted to bring the region together? I will mention, of course, the open Balkans, but I don't want to focus on that. There's a thing that has appeared in the region itself with all of its shortcomings, but it's sort of a response to this. Things haven't moved quickly enough. So Heather, let me start with you.
Yeah, I can be.
I'm sure you followed all this.
Yeah, in intense detail. Yes. So the fundamental thing is, what are all of these different things intended to do? And it's basically to mirror, to shadow, to do the same kind of thing as the EU did, to provide real integration on the ground. It's basically the same logic as the coal and steel community, that after a war, if people have lots of economic ties across borders and they're doing business with each other and they have school exchanges and they know each other's languages, etc., then they're much less likely to go to war with one another. Now, that's the idea behind it. But of course, for local politicians, that's often not a big incentive because that doesn't win you votes. So why would you put lots of energy into making this happen, even if there's EU money on the table, if nobody really sees the point of it? And if also it's not as if there are massive flows of capital which are going to provide jobs immediately. I mean, I think it's the lack of immediate tangible rewards which even mayors and regional politicians would see as an advantage. So I think this is it's all about. So I was talking about on the EU side how you need to overcome the resistance of the kind of interests for the status quo with geostrategic and security ones. Here the resistance is interest in the status quo, often in the nexus between local business and local politicians. And the only way you do that is by providing an overwhelming incentive. Now, that worked in the run-up to the 2004 enlargement because there was really a lot of money at stake and there were lots of jobs at stake. And the integration of Central Europe into European supply chains was creating a dynamic and a momentum which people could really feel and politicians needed to buy into. If there was a threat that Audi was going to leave Hungary again, that would have been disastrous for any politician. Whereas the lack of integration into European supply chains is actually a huge problem. Now, there are various reasons for that we could go into, but I think that's the fundamental problem. And also, of course, there have been many politicians in the region over the past 2 decades who have sought, in fact, to increase the distance. I mean, we can think about the way the languages have become more different rather than together. We can think about education curricula that have become different. So you think how hard France and Germany worked in the 1950s and 60s and 70s to overcome this kind of natural, in a way natural, kind of this historical almost divergence between their peoples, with all these myriad economic links and exchanges. It's not something that happens that naturally. And the EU was their project in order to do that, and a lot of quite far-sighted politicians who saw this as the only way. But this has not worked in the same way, and that's why I think these processes have become kind of routine meetings of ministers.
The floor to you, just to mention that, I mean, those of us who follow this know there is a very intense regional life in the region. I mean, exchanges, sports, media, and most of all, business. I mean, whatever the sour relationships between Croatia and Serbia at the moment, there was news just as we were going to Alpbach that in the first 6 months, trade between Serbia and Croatia had gone up by 35%. I mean, the businesses are working. They need oxygen, and they have it because they work very, very well across borders in so many ways. So it's not that these are communicating vessels at so many levels, it's really at the political level that sometimes, you know, it seems that there's nothing going on. Sorry, Kristof.
No. Well, I think we need to distinguish between two or three kind of, I don't know, species in these kind of cooperation schemes. I think one is what we could maybe politely call complementary, you know, to the accession process, in the sense, you know, you focus on infrastructure, I don't know, energy, Berlin process, you know. I think it got quite a lot of, and in my view, maybe too much attention, because just not very much was moving in the real process. Yeah. But I think it's very different from, I know the accession process is basically about having civil servants not in one ministry, but basically in all, or nearly all ministries and in all sectors, basically doing really a lot at the same time, simultaneously involving also business communities, civic sector. I mean, it stretches its things out to the whole society. Yeah? And I think with these kind of initiatives, you will not get to this. And then I think we have these regional initiatives, you know, of trying to create a common regional market. And here, I'm very skeptical. First, I think you have an interest to be in a common market with big, rich neighbors, not with small, poor neighbors. Yeah? That's the first thing. So if I want to be in a common market with Austria, with Germany, with Italy, with Romania, yeah? You know, with Bosnia, with North Macedonia, I mean, that's not really dramatically interesting and attractive. And the thing also is, this is hugely ambitious. And I sometimes wonder if the politicians proposing this, I mean, if you want to create a really an integrated, you know, common market in the Balkans, this essentially it would be the same amount of work than you would need to integrate with the European single market. You would basically create institutions. And I think it would be just much more difficult also. Because if you integrate in the European single market, I mean, most people trust, you know, the European Court of Justice, their institutions, the European Commission. But basically for the regional one, you know, who is going to set that up, you know? A court basically stuffed with judges from Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, because I don't really see it happening, frankly. And maybe the third thing, but then of course you have, I don't know, business communities, and that's I think yet another story, who cooperate, who draw on old networks, who invest cross-country. I think it's not new, it's happening. If it's happening more, I think that's good, but I think it's not a replacement for the bigger vision.
Okay, let's open it up to our audience here. Questions, Vishnya? And do introduce yourself for the better.
Yes, so I'm Vishnya Vukov. I'm from the Department of Political Science, University of Vienna. Thanks a lot for this great discussion, and I'm particularly happy that we have some concrete proposals on the table. I like very much the first one, and I think that would be a really good move and wise move on the side of the EU. But I'm more skeptical about the second one, about this only single market membership. And so first I have a clarification question. If you say that all the European democracies could be part of the single market, would that mean that in effect the other two types of conditions, basically the economic conditionality and the institutional conditionality, that was standard part of the EU enlargement process, so being able to, you know, functioning market economy is able to compete in the single market, fulfilling the acquis requirements, etc., does that just get out of the table? Does it mean that these kind of conditions get out of the table if the emphasis is just on the political conditionality? If it does, that would be very, very dangerous, because actually, you know, there is quite some work done on how exactly sort of the institutional efforts and influences and exercises of sort of preparing these countries for joining the single market was one of the main reasons why they could join the supply chains that Heather was talking about and could sort of relatively thrive. But the second and a bigger issue perhaps is the problem of democratic legitimacy. Now, of course, the single market is not just about the free movement of factors of production, it is also primarily about the common rules in which this market needs to be embedded. Now, if you do not have the seat at the table, what basically these countries would sign up for is to comply with these kind of rules, but without actually having a say in making these rules. And now you could say that, of course, it's a decision of individual country to join this arrangement. But 5 or 6 years after they decided, 5 or 6 years down the road, it becomes costly to get out, but they still don't have the seat at the table, and they still cannot really have a say in the kinds of economic rules that they would have to comply with. And I think this can create big problems of democratic legitimacy. It can basically hollow out their democracies to a large extent, and this can then, of course, be a very fertile ground for different kind of, populism, anti-systemic parties, etc. So I'm just afraid that this kind of proposal 5, 6, 10 years down the road could actually lead to even bigger democratic problems. Thanks.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks very much, and thanks really for the question. Let me try to clarify what I was thinking. I think in terms of conditions, basically more or less everything on the table. If you basically want to be part of the single market, you have to really function. That means basically economic criteria, competitive pressures, and this means basically essentially these countries would really need to access to European Union funds in basically the same to the same amount as EU members, because otherwise that would not, it would not function. I think a strong focus also on the rule of law. We cannot basically have a similar market if we cannot trust that judicial decisions are taken in a reasonable way. So administrative standards, yes. So I think that should all be on it. Essentially, I think it would mean meeting, really the biggest chunk of the criteria necessary, which would be necessary also to join the union. They would get very far. Yeah? Democratic legitimacy. Well, you are right, of course. In a way, it's a compromise. No, it's a compromise saying, ideally, we would not have this discussion at all. We would basically have a process like in 2004, and and it would just be like this. But it isn't, and it's a way of trying to get out of this dilemma. So basically of having an attractive goal at the same time, while we still have several member states who are really kind of not wanting to have further enlargement with people sitting at the table making these decisions. Now, what you can of course also say, this is still hugely attractive, for Norway, Iceland, who are part of the single market, who also don't have anyone sitting at the table making the rules. And so and Norway as a rich country is actually paying a lot to actually be part of this. And we can also look to the UK where, the UK who is discovering now what actually it means to lose, being part of the single market, and what costs this entails. So I think eventually, if this would be offered to the accession countries, I think it would be an opportunity to basically have them motivated and work intensively for the coming, 6, 8 years, without us having to think about these political problems, bilateral vetoes, nothing moving forward, etc. And I think it would also help to convince skeptics in the European Union. Because, Macron's, mindset or ideas or vision is one thing, but you, of course, also in the Dutch parliament or in the German parliament, you have people who are just wondering, will these countries actually, can they make it, Can they become decent EU members, Because at the moment, not very much is moving forward in the region. I think that's a sort of a bit of a vicious circle. So if countries would become so prepared that they would be able to join the single market, I think the prospects of eventual membership would also rise. So I think I would take the bet, if this has, democratic repercussions later on, I don't know. I think it would be hugely beneficial to citizens of those countries as well. And it's not that in the absence of this, and let's say another 2, 4, 6 years of nothing moving without a credible vision for anything towards, or in terms of movement towards the European Union, I'm not really sure if this would bode better for the democratic development of those countries.
Heather, do you want to comment on that? And can I just ask you maybe to say whether in Great Britain there is an awareness, even if it's unspoken, of what has been lost with the single market at least?
Here we enter another seminar.
Okay, I know.
The amount of disinformation about the EU and the single market in the UK is really quite staggering. But I think the thing is, the link between democratic debate and the single market acquis is tenuous at best. There are only a few areas of single market acquis that ever really reach public debate. Now, that can become extremely heated when it's around iconic products or particular industries. So fisheries is a big one. And of course, the irony in the UK case was that the fishermen were promised, you'll be free, you can do whatever you want. And then they suddenly discovered, no, what it means is the Spaniards can come and fish, do whatever they want in UK waters. It's a disaster. The UK fishing industry has collapsed after Brexit. So yeah, this did not bring the benefits that were promised, but that's a huge story. But no, I mean, if you think about it, so as Kristof was pointing out, Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, Switzerland are all policy takers from the EU. They all have very deep integration into the single market, and they don't have any kind of seat at the table. But the problems that causes them, they have councils in which they can discuss these things. Yes, they're wealthy, but most of what comes up in domestic politics is not hugely influenced by this. Movement of people is. I mean, in Switzerland, the really controversial thing is Switzerland's a member of Schengen, and it's the number of EU citizens who live in the country and the number of foreigners who can go in and out. It's all about migration policy. Yeah, it's not the market that's the problem. And in practice, in the Balkans, they have a very high degree of market access already to the single market. So it's not really about trade and market access either. It's about things like product standards. So for example, a big issue in the Swedish referendum, and Sweden nearly voted not to join the EU in 1995, like Norway did. It was very close. It was about wet snuff. It was about mouth tobacco. Which the EU bans, because it is horrendous stuff, but which was is popular in Sweden and remains popular, and there had to be an exception. With Poland, one of the most controversial things was, there was a whole thing about could vodka be made from grain rather than from potatoes. That was a very big deal in Poland. So it's around these kinds of, I'm just imagining the crisis in the region if the EU said, sorry, Jute also is not allowed in the EU. It doesn't meet EU standards. We're not having this. Yeah, it would be something like that, a sort of way of life issue that really hits the public debate. Most of the single market rules and regulations don't. What's tricky is they are expensive to implement. So if you're not getting the economic benefits, and here it's not so much about trade access, it's really about investment, the foreign direct investment that brings jobs to the region, which is really key. So if you think about what the EU's been doing on digital, and now of course on the green agenda as well, if the EU were to come with the kinds of levels of financial support that the poorer existing members are getting, then there would be no controversy, I think, about reaching the single market norms. It's the fact that because the amount of money involved would be so large. So I don't really think it's such an issue. It's a theoretical issue, but in real practical politics, I think it doesn't play such a role. I think what's really tricky now is that there are economic and political interests in the region which are very much in favor of making a fuss about these kinds of things. For example, the way that the energy industry in the region has been bought up by Russian and Chinese interests, that then causes massive lobbying against joining the single energy market. And I think if we're talking about some of these regional things that should have happened over the years, full integration into the EU energy markets is something that definitely should have happened, and that's where the EU completely lost out in terms of strategic competition.
I agree with you. Okay, next question, Mirjana, and then behind Mirjana. We'll take these two questions.
Mirjana Tomic, Presse Club Concordia. Very simple and non-theoretical question. Kristof, this proposal of yours, where do you stand when it comes to free movement of people in respect, in this single market or unified market, would people be able to move and work freely in the Western Europe? And if so, you do know how many young people dream of leaving the countries. So how would you keep them? How would you guarantee that there is trust in the local institutions to stay? You're making comparisons with Norway. I don't know if there are so many young Norwegians dreaming of leaving Norway. Thank you.
And behind you.
Thank you very much. Simon Ilse, I'm the former director of Heinrich Böll Stiftung in Belgrade for the last 4 years. Thanks very much for the proposed topics and thoughts, very enriching. I just would like to pick on one point which you also mentioned, which is empowering reformists, because I think in the countries, because I think we really do have a situation here which we now, obviously with this discussion, we're not going to resolve completely, but I would love to squeeze a bit more your brains on it, because we arguably have used some of the human factors that you mentioned. So there is visa liberalizations for all the countries except Kosovo. There is a lot of companies already with access to the markets. For example, in Serbia, you have DM, you have Decathlon, IKEA, Lidl, or whatever, you know. And still you have a situation where you have a regime in Serbia, to take that example, that is largely doesn't resemble a government that you would like to have in the EU, but what would much more look like another Orban in the EU, which nobody has an interest in having, except Mr. Orban himself, maybe. But so what? How do we go really further with that? Since this integration and this benefits for people didn't pay off completely so far, and how do we look beyond the governments and the first level of intergovernmental cooperation, and look more into the countries and into what's going on in the societies, and who are really the reformists, who are really the pro-European groups. You know, we've spent the last 4 or 5 years with Heinrich Böll in supporting a lot of environmentalists. There's now a few of them in the Belgrade City Council and in the National Parliament. I think it's a great start, but it's obviously not enough, and it's only a start. And you still see that all the governments, European governments, when they come to Belgrade, they only meet Vučić and Brnabić and a few other ministers, and there's very little engagement really with these real reformists that are the real partners of the Europeans. You know, these governments, they're not actually partners in the European sense when it comes to values. So I hope I was clear more or less. It was more of a comment. Thank you.
Go for it, Kristof.
Go ahead.
Okay, Mirjana. Yes, I think free movement of people would be included. Yeah, possibly with kind of transition periods, like in enlargements rounds earlier on. But would people leave? Yes. I mean, people are leaving now. I know the Germans run a relatively big scheme with the Western Balkans, and I think that's difficult to avoid, to be very frank. And I think when we look at at Estonia, at Poland, at Bulgaria, you name it, Romania, yeah, is doing economically very well, but basically people have been leaving a lot. I think that the crucial thing is basically to limit the time when people want to leave. I know from Ireland, people have been leaving for hundreds of years. In Estonia, people have stopped leaving, and some come back. It's not to say that this is not a challenge, but I think I don't see any. I think we cannot keep young people in Serbia or in Bosnia by force, by saying, oh no, we cannot basically give them free movement of people because then they all leave, so we have to, somehow keep them in the cage. I think that would not work. And I think the sooner there is a serious process which would basically trigger similar economic developments as, let's say, in Romania, which has moved virtually from 25% of the EU average per capita, compensated for price differences, to 70% now. Then basically, I think that's the best way of limiting actually these dynamics that people basically just continue to leave. On the empowering reformists question, I think you can look actually wherever you want in the Balkans. There have been moments when countries, also Bosnia, when it was about visa-free travel, or when it was about filling the questionnaire, or about SAA. Then at these moments there were people, in the in the Directorate for European Integration, in the line ministries, who became important because it was an issue. So regardless who was in power, had to rely on these people because there was a benefit, there were things to do, and I think what we have seen in Serbia now, because it's not Vucic himself says, when we are told we are opening a new chapter, my cabinet laughs. That's what he said, I think, a year ago. And actually, I understand it because it doesn't mean anything. And but let's not forget, the radical party split because of the EU. It was that was actually the splitting point of sort of the far right. So I think if there is a prospect, then you can and you would automatically actually make these reformers relevant anymore. Now they are not. Everyone basically can point fingers at them and say, what are you talking about? This is just not serious. And I think actually it would be very understandable, no? It's difficult to make a counter-argument at the current moment.
It's always very easy for politicians on both sides to play the game of, you're my friend, I'm going to support you, never mind about the conditionality. And this is very, very dangerous for reformers and for conditionality. I remember a very clever colleague of mine in the Commission was in charge of the Croatia file when Croatia was in negotiations. And there were all these politicians who said, I'm a friend of Croatia. My country historically has always been a friend of Croatia. We were the first to recognize, da, da, da. And Sanader stood there and just lapped it up and said, I don't need to do any reforms. I'm going to do whatever I like because these guys are my friends and they're just going to let me in. And it was the kind of bad guy commissioner who had to go, excuse me, there are some conditions to fulfill. And I remember my very intelligent colleague in the commission looking around the room in one of these meetings of all the cabinets with all these people who were saying, my commissioner is a friend of Croatia. And he said, look, if you're a true friend of Croatia, you will be incentivizing and promoting and helping and supporting the reformers in that country, not those who seek to corrupt it. Right? And where did Sanader end up? In jail because of corruption. Okay, so I think this conflation of historical closeness to a country and its current leadership is extremely dangerous. And we've heard it so many times. I'm a friend of Serbia, we can't, blah, blah. I've also heard it, I'm a friend of Hungary, my country did terrible things to Hungary in the past, therefore Orban can do whatever he likes now. This is always a bad idea. It's very bad for democracy. Okay, it's not just bad for enlargement, it's bad for democracy. And I think the horrendous case study that needs to be written up, there's a really important PhD to be written about what happened in North Macedonia. That there was an extremely corrupt government that rode roughshod over the rule of law, had a massive budget deficit, and was doing some terrible things, which then lost an election to a reformist pro-European government that started doing what the EU asked for. And the former prime minister, in order to escape arrest, was driven in a diplomatic convoy of one of the member states of the EU to a dacha outside the capital, where he lives now, to avoid prosecution in his home country. I mean, is this the opposite of conditionality or what? And then the subsequent reformist government, which tried to put things in order and overcome the corruption and did many, many of the very difficult things that the EU demanded, was then brought down by a commissioner appointed by that same member state prime minister who said, no, it's not time for this country to move forward. And that did cause the collapse of the government. Now, that is the object lesson in how to destroy conditionality. And that's where it really falls apart because, it's the 3 C's. If the conditionality is not credible, it's not consistent, and it's not coherent, the whole thing is not going to work. It has to be credible, as Kristof was saying earlier, because otherwise the real the magic fairy dust of people's expectations, of people's hopes that joining the EU is only one election away. It's just over the horizon. It's only 5 years away. That only works when the prospect of accession is near enough to be credible. It only works if it's consistent, if the EU keeps asking for the same things over time and all the member states ask for the same things and they don't play the "you're my friend" game. And if it's coherent, if the conditions don't contradict one another, which sometimes they can. And I mean, to come back to Vishna's point about the political, economic and institutional conditions, often these things are conflated and actually they are somewhat different kinds of conditions. But the problem with the EU is it only really has an acquis, a body of law for the third one, and the first two, the market economy and the stability of institutions guaranteeing democracy, much harder to do. And that's where it loses coherence somewhat. So that's the tricky thing. But yeah, the conditionality absolutely depends on there being enough self-discipline within the EU not to undermine it.
Yeah, and to state the obvious, the fact that the backsliding of democracy in member states such as Hungary and Poland has not been tackled with robustly is actually a stick in the wheel of the enlargement process, because it encourages the autocratic leanings of people in leadership in some of the Western Balkan countries, and that is not a good example. So if you get a free pass as a member state, why should I, in a candidate country, have to bother? So I think one of the many things that needs to be done is, and we're seeing it. Obviously, EU is slow, but it moves. Article 7 has been invoked on Hungary. Now the disbursement of the recovery funds to Hungary is under question. We'll see what happens, but I think the EU, as the colloquial expression goes, needs to clean its own house before asking for things outside of its house. Are there any more questions? If not, we have come to... Oh, there's one question. We'll take that.
Hello, my name is Ingrid Sager. I work for the Commission on Serbian accession negotiations since many years. I wanted to make one point. I really think that everything we discuss now about the dynamics of in the enlargement process, about the narrative on enlargement, will be decided basically on the battlefield in Ukraine. And it will very much depend on the outcome, the timing because I really think that there are chances that the Ukraine will be driving the narrative. So I would be interested in your views on that. And the second point, I want to make a second point, which is on the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue, because we haven't mentioned it here. But obviously, I mean, one conclusion on working for so many years in the region is that this is really very decisive for the future of the whole region. And unfortunately, we see no willingness on the ground. And the question will very much be also whether in relation to the crisis with Ukraine, whether there could be some movement, some linkages made in let's say, the outcome that we may see next year, the year after, etc. So I would be interested in hearing your views on that.
Any thoughts?
Well, yes, you're right. The battlefield is absolutely critical. If Ukraine, as we all hope, is able to have a clear outcome of this conflict where it remains an independent country in control of at least most of its territory as it is now, the EU will rise to the occasion. That will create a geopolitical moment on a par with 89 and 2003 and so on, at which promises will be made which will vastly affect the Balkans and will bring the Balkans in, I think. So I think you're absolutely right, it's fundamental. And it's also true, I mean, you're pointing out something, a very terrible reality, that if it descends into a low-level conflict that goes on for years and years and years and is absolutely debilitating for Ukraine, the EU, for all of the good intentions that I think are real at the moment, the EU will have great difficulty in integrating it. That's why I think actually, this is another seminar to have, but that's why this thing of integrating into the single market progressively is all the more important, because Ukraine may well be in a situation where it does not have control of all of its territory and it's not really a sovereign country. And so being able to do sectoral integration without that would be very important because it won't be able to join the EU. So that's why the alternative needs to be fleshed out now into something real. But you're absolutely right. This is the fundamental point. So, you know, so much rides on Zelensky and on the soldiers. That's the geopolitical reality of it.
Yeah. I fully agree. I think at the you know, when Ukraine applied, a lot of my Balkan friends said, no, we don't want to be put in the same basket. You know, we are in this already for 15 years. They're just new. And I said, well, maybe, I don't know, maybe you rather be in the same basket. Otherwise, you see the other basket basically passing in front of your eyes. And on the dialogue, your second question, I think pushing for normalization in the day-to-day issues would be tremendously good, and I think we have not really been very successful in this, unfortunately, over these last years, now when we look at basically the scoreboard. But I'm also very skeptical that this could lead now to a, I don't know, to a, how you say, a final arrangement, or how is it called? A
comprehensive
arrangement, yeah. Because you know, what is in for Serbia at the moment? I mean, why should Serbia now recognize Kosovo? I mean, I would like them to, but you know, why should it? What's the incentive? What is there for Serbia to get in return? Once there is a real prospect of becoming a EU member, and you have at the end a referendum put in front of Serbian citizens, say, okay, do you want to become a EU member now and recognize Kosovo, or do you not want to become a EU member and, you know, keep not recognizing Kosovo? I think that might be a choice which might work, and then we might reach a stage where Serbia has something to gain by doing this. But in the current circumstances, with a stuck accession process, I don't really see much interest for Serbia to move on this.
If I may add, no, you're absolutely right on Serbia-Kosovo. That is a game changer for the whole region. And, you know, whether one likes it or not, in this mini region of 6 countries, Serbia is the biggest country. So that when that piece of the puzzle falls in place, somehow the others, and that's been clear since the whole thing started. There is something happening. We don't quite know, and maybe it's better that we don't know, because all of this has been in the open. If something is happening behind closed doors, and the fact that Miroslav Lajčák visited with the German and French diplomats who have been tasked by Macron and Scholz, Jens Plättner and Emmanuel Bon, we'll see. I mean, I'm not holding my breath. I've been in this business all too long and had many failed expectations. So what's clear is that no one moves without this solution. I like to say that Serbia needs Kosovo to move forward, and Kosovo needs Serbia, because Serbia gives the green light wherever it needs to be given. I've said that to Prime Minister Kurti when we met this summer. And the EU has been patently clear since Thessaloniki and afterwards. We will not take in a new Cyprus. We will not take in a country that has an unresolved territorial issue, which I sadly say is the case of the 3 new candidate countries. There are frozen conflicts in Ukraine, in Moldova with Transnistria, and in Georgia with Abkhazia and South Ossetia. And so, my goodness, I don't want to even go there, because if they need to do a Serbia-Kosovo in Georgia with Russia or wherever, yeah, I just hope that they move quickly and that we find ways, whether it's single markets or roaming charge. You know, we need to give, as we all know, and Heather rightly points out, roaming charges. We have in the region abolished roaming charges. So if you go from Serbia to Bosnia, you don't pay roaming charges. Why doesn't Europe do that gesture to the region? Yeah, companies will not earn 10 cents, but maybe 1 cent. And we're a drop in the bucket of a market of 500 or whatever Europeans are, not just European Union. So there are things that can be done, and that is crucial. On Serbia-Kosovo, finally, I think that the association of Serbian municipalities is absolutely key. That is in the Brussels Agreement. And I think that the argument that has been used by our Albanian friends in Kosovo that this will be a new Republika Srpska is absolutely nonsensical. Because in Europe we have so many autonomies of different sorts, whether it's Südtirol, Northern Ireland, the Faroe Islands, the status of Basque Country and Catalonia. You know, in Basque Country it's Basque policemen, 90% of the taxes paid stay in the Basque Country, and so there are many off-the-shelf solutions. You need to pick them and use them, and so the association will not be an NGO, as is said, or take Belgium. You know, in Belgium you have a German Minister of Education, and not to speak about Schleswig-Holstein and the deal between Denmark and Germany. So I think that if we are to move forward, there needs to be some sort of autonomy. It will be basically, I mean, there's a lot of it is already in the Ahtisaari Agreement. I mean, the minority rights, the preferential status in the parliament, but it's basically about education and health and oversight on those issues. So, I mean, I was born an optimist. I'm a very, very cautious optimist after my country disappeared in front of me 30 years ago. If there is leadership like the Macedonians and Greeks showed, then there will be something. If not, you know, I like to say, if you have a pain in the back, you can live with that pain until you die at age 100. But yeah, maybe it's nicer not to live with a pain in the back and solve an issue that you have, in this case, a territorial issue. Having said that, please join me in thanking Heather and Kristof for this really great discussion that we've had.